Okay, so we're going through the week 7 material on the respiratory system, and here's our hemisected head. Just to give you a perspective, there's the obvious head side. Okay, and we're turning it. Basically, we have a mid-sagittal section here. Okay, so there's lots of parts of the brain and the spinal cord that you might remember from A&P 1. We're going to concentrate on the respiratory structures on this model. Okay, so if we kind of pick it up again and come to this location, this is where air is entering the respiratory passages. So that is the nostril. The more official name for it is the external nair, but we're using nostril in the textbook and the lab manual now. So the air would have come in. I'm going to put the probe in there so you can see it coming in. So air would be coming into the respiratory passages. And remember, there would be bone right here, okay, that nasal septum made up of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the vomer that you looked at in A&P 1. So there'd be another nasal passage over here on this side. Okay, and we can see once we're in the nasal passages that we have these little shelves of bone that are sticking out, creating surface area, and these are the nasal concha. Okay, so we have superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. Remember that all of the conducting zone organs, which are the organs that allow air to eventually get to the respiratory zone, are going to help us as far as warming, humidifying, and cleaning the air as it's moving through. So the amount of surface area that you have here in these nasal concha is going to give you a lot of room to warm, moisten, and clean the air as it's going past. And they also, their other name is the turbinates. They also increase the turbulence of air as it's going past, so that allows it to move around and get thrown into the walls covered with sticky mucus, and that helps them to be cleaned significantly. We also have attached to the nasal passages by little channels, we have these openings, which are some of the paranasal sinuses. The ones that we can see here are the frontal sinus and the sphenoid sinus. Okay, we'll see a picture in a couple of minutes where we see the other paranasal sinuses. But those sinuses help to lighten the skull, and they also provide nice resonance chambers for speech. Okay, we also have here on the floor of the nasal passages the hard or bony palate made of bone, and then we have the soft palate here made of muscle, smooth muscle, or excuse me, skeletal muscle. What am I saying? Skeletal muscle, and some other and some connective tissues. And then we have this as a location that can elevate when we're swallowing to prevent material from coming up into the nasal passages. Okay. Then once we get past the nasal passages and the border between the nasal passages and the throat is basically around right here. This would be the internal nares. Okay. And then we get to this location, which is the pharynx. Okay. The common name for the pharynx would be the throat. And the pharynx can be divided into 3 sections: the nasopharynx, which is close to the nasal passages, the oropharynx, which is close to the oral passages, and then the laryngopharynx, which is close to the larynx. Okay, there are a number of tonsils in this location. The one right here is the pharyngeal tonsil. This is the one that if it becomes enlarged would be called the adenoid. Okay. Right here we have the palatine tonsil, and there'd be a second palatine tonsil on this side. And these are the ones that people refer to as the tonsils, as in I had my tonsils out. So those are the palatine tonsils. Those are the ones that you can see if someone opens their mouth. You can see those tonsils in their oropharynx. Okay, and then we have a tonsil here on the tongue. Here's most of the mass of the tongue. And then right here, this would be the area where you have the lingual tonsil. Okay, and lingua is root meaning related to language, like linguistics. Okay, so that's why it's the lingual tonsil. Okay. Now, as we get to the laryngopharynx, we're right next to the larynx. Okay, and this part of the larynx is the epiglottis. This is what closes to cover the glottis during swallowing. Okay, and you can see the vocal fold here that vibrates to produce speech and sound. Okay, and then we have the thyroid cartilage here. The trachea would be coming off this way. Okay, and here's the esophagus, which we'll be talking about this week in lab. Okay, so when we're in the nasal passages, it's respiratory only. When we get into the nasopharynx, it's still pretty respiratory only. But then once we get into the oropharynx, we have an area that's shared by the respiratory system and the digestive system. Same thing for the laryngopharynx. Okay, it's an area that's shared by the respiratory system and the digestive system. It isn't until you get past the laryngopharynx that you're now separating air from swallowed material. Okay? All right, we have another hemisected head here. We can see a lot of the same material, so we'll go through that a little more rapidly. Okay, so here is the nostril. You can see the probe coming through there. Nasal passages, superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. And some of the bone has been cut away, so you can see the meatus deep to it and the little passageways that connect to the sinuses. Okay, so here's the frontal sinus and the sphenoid sinus again. Here's the pharyngeal tonsil, palatine tonsil, and the lingual tonsil. Okay, and the tonsils, remember, are there to help control bacterial populations in the oral and nasal passages and those mucous membranes. Okay, and we have the hard palate and the soft palate. The hard palate separates the respiratory passages from the oral cavity. Here's the epiglottis. Here's the vocal fold, thyroid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage. Here's the trachea. Here's the esophagus. And then our three sections of the pharynx: nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Okay? Now the models that we have, you cannot see the other two paranasal sinuses. I have a picture of those for you here. Here's the frontal sinus that we were looking at previously. Here's the sphenoid sinus. The little one here labeled with the B that has all the little subdivisions, that's the ethmoid sinus, which is sometimes referred to as the ethmoid air cells. And the large one here in red, which is the largest of the paranasal sinuses, is the maxillary sinus. Most people know about the frontal and the maxillary because those are the ones that they usually notice if they have any sort of sinus infection or inflammation. Okay. Here's our model of the larynx. We'll turn it around to the anterior view first. Here's the hyoid bone. Okay, and here's the thyroid cartilage. Okay, and that's kind of a shield-shaped cartilage. This is going to have a more prominent anterior component. In males, that's what actually produces the Adam's apple that you see in males. Okay, the next one inferiorly is the cricoid cartilage. Okay, and as we turn around, you can see the cricoid cartilage gets significantly larger as you move to the posterior side of the larynx. Okay, and these two little pyramid-shaped cartilages are the arytenoid cartilages. Now, the arytenoid cartilages are the ones that actually would move the vocal folds. So if I pull on these a little bit, you can see how those pink structures are moving. Those pink structures are the vocal folds. Okay, and the space in between them is the glottis. Okay, and so if somebody was being intubated because they needed help with respiration, the tube that they would insert would go right here into the glottis to give access to the trachea, and that's why the person can't talk when they're intubated. Okay, now what's been broken off of this model is this structure that looks like a tongue, but it's not. Okay, and all of the different cartilages we talked about up until this point have been hyaline cartilage. This one is the only one that's a different type of cartilage. This is the epiglottis. This is composed of elastic cartilage. And someone tried to make it elastic and make it fold over the glottis, but it really wasn't elastic enough, and so it broke off. And that's why it's in a separate piece now. Okay? So we said the job of the epiglottis was to fold over the glottis during swallowing. That's preventing any swallowed material from getting through the glottis, past the larynx, and into the trachea. Okay, so we're going to move to this model. We have the structures of the larynx here: thyroid cartilage, epiglottis, vocal fold, cricoid cartilage. Okay, and as we get past all of that, we get to the trachea. Okay, so you can see the beautiful C-shaped cartilage rings, and they're not going to be present on the posterior surface. We're only going to have smooth muscle and softer, more elastic tissues here on the posterior surface. Okay, from the trachea, we divide into the primary bronchi. You can see the right primary bronchus is short, straight, and more vertical than the left. From the primary bronchus or main bronchus, we divide into secondary or lobar bronchi. Here's one secondary bronchus on the left. Here's the other one on the left. Okay, they're a little harder to find on the right. Here's one here. And then these two on this side are kind of merged together. They're hard to see, but there's one here and one here. Okay? And then all the places where you see the little colored tips, those would be tertiary or segmental bronchi. Okay, so there's one trachea, there's one main bronchus or primary bronchus for each lung, there's one secondary bronchus or lobar bronchus for each lobe, and then there's one set of tertiary bronchi for each bronchopulmonary segment. Okay, and that's why they have the other name as the segmental bronchi.